Patricia Combs and Benjamin Reed appeared to be an unusual but loving couple until a hidden truth exploded into the national spotlight. Patricia was not just Benjamin's wife, she was his biological mother. What began as a bizarre love story, it spiraled into one of the most shocking and disturbing true crime cases in modern history, a tale of manipulation, obsession, and a bond that crossed every imaginable line. Patricia Combs lived a quiet life in the outskirts of Stillwater, Oklahoma, a town where everyone knew everyone else, or at least they thought they did. She was the kind of neighbor who waved politely but never invited anyone over. People described her as kind but reserved, someone who seemed to carry a permanent sadness in her eyes. She worked odd jobs over the years, cleaning homes, working in a thrift store, and once even as a caretaker in a nursing facility. She never stayed in one place for too long, moving houses and sometimes entire towns without much explanation. Most people chalked it up to a rough past, and no one pried. Patricia didn't have many friends, but she wasn't unfriendly. She simply lived a life behind closed doors. Over the years, Patricia had been married multiple times. Her first husband died in a car accident when she was in her early 20s. Her second left her without warning, taking their toddler son with him. That son, named Benjamin, was never seen again by her or anyone in the town. Rumors swirled that Patricia had been abusive, but nothing was ever confirmed. Her third husband, Richard, was a truck driver who was rarely home. One day in 2009, he simply vanished. His truck was found abandoned in Colorado, but Patricia didn't seem shocked. She told police he had likely run off with another woman, and the investigation didn't go far. Without evidence of foul play, authorities labeled him a missing person and moved on. After that, Patricia withdrew even more from the world. Then came 2015, a year that would change everything. Patricia suddenly became active online, creating a Facebook profile and posting cryptic, emotional messages about love, fate, and second chances. Her profile picture was a blurry photo of her standing beside a much younger man. At first, people thought he might be her son, but then came the announcement she was getting married. Friends and distant relatives were shocked when she posted wedding photos with a man named Benjamin Reed. Patricia was 42. He was 25. The age gap raised eyebrows, but it was the way she spoke about him, calling him her soulmate, her true beginning, and her perfect reflection, that made people uneasy. Some questioned whether this Benjamin was the same son who had vanished decades earlier, but Patricia denied it to the few who asked. She claimed they met through a support group online and fell in love instantly. They married in a small courthouse ceremony in New Mexico. Patricia wore a simple white dress. Benjamin looked pale, almost hesitant in the photos. Neighbors who met him described him as shy and withdrawn. He didn't make eye contact and barely spoke, but Patricia seemed overjoyed, acting more youthful and energized than anyone had ever seen her. No one could have imagined the dark truth behind the marriage. Most simply wrote it off as another strange twist in the life of a woman who had already seen so much tragedy. But beneath the surface, something deeply disturbing was unfolding, something that would eventually shock the entire country. In the fall of 2016, a routine audit at the county clerk's office in Santa Fe, New Mexico, set off a chain of events that would uncover one of the most disturbing cases the state had ever seen. Melanie Crawford, a diligent and meticulous clerk, was tasked with reviewing marriage licenses issued over the past 5 years. It was a standard assignment meant to ensure all documents were properly recorded and stored. But as she sifted through the paperwork, she paused when she came across a marriage license issued to Patricia Combs and Benjamin Reed. Something about it didn't sit right. Their age difference was one thing, but the names triggered a memory. She had seen both names before on older state welfare documents. Melanie's curiosity got the better of her. She pulled up old records from the Department of Child Services and, to her astonishment, discovered a connection no one had noticed before. Benjamin Reed was listed in the system as a child who had been given up for adoption in 1991. His birth mother's name was Patricia Combs. There was no mistaking it. The social security numbers matched. Birth certificates confirmed it. Patricia had married her own biological son. Melanie double-checked every detail, hoping she had made a mistake. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, it was something far more horrifying. She immediately reported her findings to her supervisor, who escalated the case to law enforcement. The initial reaction among investigators was disbelief. It seemed too bizarre, too grotesque to be real. But the records didn't lie. Patricia had relinquished Benjamin when he was an infant, and they had been separated for over 18 years. They had reconnected only after he turned 21, and somehow, within a few short years, they had entered into a romantic relationship that led to a legal marriage. Investigators began digging deeper into both of their lives, tracking their movements and gathering any public records they could find. When authorities tried to locate Patricia and Benjamin at the address listed on their marriage license, they found an empty house. The couple had moved out just days before. The landlord told investigators they had packed in a hurry, leaving behind only a few broken appliances and a mattress. Their phones had been disconnected, their social media accounts deleted. Bank accounts showed no recent activity. It was as if they had vanished off the face of the earth. News of the case began to circulate quietly among law enforcement circles, but the public was still unaware. Investigators feared that going public too soon might drive the couple even deeper into hiding. Behind the scenes, however, a full-scale manhunt had begun. Agents from multiple states were looped into the search. Lists of motels, shelters, and hospitals were scanned for any sign of Patricia or Benjamin, but no one reported seeing them. They had disappeared into the shadows, carefully covering their tracks. What had started as a simple audit had exposed something unthinkable. Mother who had not only reunited with her lost son, but legally married him, deceiving the system and fleeing before the truth could catch up. 2 years passed with no trace of Patricia Combs or Benjamin Reed. The authorities followed every lead, monitored ID activity, and flagged both their social security numbers, but nothing surfaced. It was as if they had ceased to exist. Most investigators believed they had crossed the border into Mexico or perhaps assumed entirely new identities in another remote state. Their photos were quietly circulated among hospitals, shelters, and DMV offices. But the case faded from the public eye since it had never gone fully public in the first place. For most, it became a forgotten file, bizarre, horrifying, but unsolved. That changed in the spring of 2018, when a man was brought into an emergency room in Kansas City after a late-night car accident. He had suffered a fractured arm and minor head trauma but remained conscious and alert. He gave his name as Mark Daniels and claimed he had no ID on him. While the hospital staff began treatment, the billing department noticed that the insurance number he gave belonged to someone else. The discrepancy triggered a background check, and when his fingerprints were taken for identification, a flag was raised. The man wasn't Mark Daniels at all. He was Benjamin Reed. Authorities were contacted immediately. By the time investigators arrived at the hospital, Benjamin was recovering in a shared apartment just a few blocks away. Surveillance teams moved in cautiously, hoping to avoid scaring him off. Inside the apartment, officers found Patricia Combs, now going by the name Claire Adams. She answered the door calmly, even pleasantly, as though nothing were wrong. She seemed older, thinner, with streaks of gray in her hair and a weary expression that didn't match the disturbing history she carried. The apartment itself was spotless and sparse. No photographs on the walls, no visitors logged by the front desk in the last year. The only personal items were hidden in drawers, dozens of handwritten journals, marriage certificates, false IDs, and an envelope stuffed with old photographs, some dating back to Benjamin's childhood. Investigators were chilled to discover that the photos had been carefully trimmed, reframed, and altered, removing or obscuring the faces of other relatives, creating a false narrative of a life shared by only the two of them. More disturbing were the notebooks, page after page filled with Patricia's neat cursive, speaking of destiny, rebirth, and a divine connection between her and Benjamin. She wrote about how society had wronged them, how laws were made by people who didn't understand true love, and how their bond transcended rules and blood. Some entries described ways to avoid detection, how to erase digital footprints, and theories about escaping the country if necessary. The evidence left no doubt. This was not a spontaneous reunion gone wrong. It was calculated, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. Benjamin, pale and emotionally detached, didn't resist arrest. He barely spoke. Authorities noted how passive he seemed, as though his will had been drained over time. Forensic psychologists would later describe him as a textbook victim of prolonged manipulation. With Patricia in custody and the truth finally exposed, a dark and twisted love story that had been hiding in plain sight was about to unravel in the eyes of the world. Once Patricia Combs and Benjamin Reed were in custody, the full scale of the psychological damage began to emerge. Initial interviews revealed little Patricia remained composed, often smiling softly as if amused by the attention, while Benjamin sat in silence, his eyes unfocused and hands clenched tightly in his lap. It was quickly evident to authorities that this was not a conventional criminal case. The motivations were far deeper than deception or evasion of law. This was a story rooted in mental illness, emotional manipulation, and years of deeply embedded trauma. Patricia underwent a thorough psychological evaluation. Experts diagnosed her with a severe personality disorder compounded by unresolved trauma from her own childhood. Her parents had abandoned her at an early age, and she had cycled through multiple foster homes, each leaving its own scars. By the time she reached adulthood, Patricia had developed an obsessive need for control. Her early relationships had all followed a similar pattern: intense devotion followed by violent breakdowns. With each failure, her mistrust of others deepened, and her world began to close in. What disturbed the evaluators most was Patricia's unwavering belief that what she had with Benjamin was not only acceptable, but pure. She referred to their relationship as a divine union, convinced that fate had brought them together after years of separation. She rejected the idea that biology should determine love, and she expressed open contempt for what she called man-made morality. Her writings detailed how she had followed Benjamin's life from afar for years, tracking him through social media and public records. When he turned 18, she reached out, framing their reunion as a mother trying to rebuild a broken bond. but from the very beginning, her intentions were far more sinister. Investigators uncovered letters Patricia had written years before they reunited, letters addressed to Benjamin, but never sent in them. She fantasized about building a new life with him, one without judgment or interference. These weren't the words of a grieving mother seeking connection. They were the writings of someone who had blurred the lines between maternal affection and romantic obsession. As for Benjamin, psychiatrists described him as emotionally dependent and psychologically worn down. He had been a bright, capable teenager, with hopes of attending college, but all that changed after Patricia came into his life. Slowly, she isolated him from friends and relatives, discouraging communication with anyone outside their bubble. She took over every aspect of his life. He wore, where he went, even how he spoke. Over time, Benjamin stopped resisting. He began to believe the narrative she had constructed, not because he agreed, but because his identity had eroded under constant pressure. By the time they married, he was no longer thinking for himself. The court eventually determined that while Benjamin had technically been a consenting adult, his capacity for consent had been manipulated to the point of collapse. He was placed under psychiatric care rather than charged. Patricia, however, was deemed fully responsible for her actions. The disturbing clarity with which she described her choices showed not confusion but intent. She had planned everything down to the fake identities, the relocation strategy, and the final disappearance. The courtroom was tense on the day Patricia Combs faced sentencing. Dozens of journalists, true crime reporters, and curious locals packed the benches, eager to witness the final chapter of a story that had left the entire country stunned. Patricia, wearing a simple gray jumpsuit and no makeup, appeared calm and collected, as if she were attending a routine appointment rather than the conclusion of a national scandal. She showed no signs of remorse. In fact, when asked if she had anything to say, she stood and spoke with eerie composure, insisting once again that her love for Benjamin was genuine and that they had harmed no one. Her words drew audible gasps from the room. She called their bond spiritual, and said society had twisted love into something shameful. The judge, unmoved, delivered a harsh but deliberate sentence, 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 12. The courtroom was silent as Patricia was led away, her face expressionless. It was the end of her physical freedom, but many feared her influence on Benjamin might linger long after her sentence began. Outside the courthouse, protesters and reporters swarmed the steps. Some held signs demanding justice for Benjamin, while others were simply trying to make sense of a story that defied understanding. Benjamin, now 28, was not present at the sentencing. After his release from psychiatric care, he chose to vanish from public life. Authorities helped him change his name and relocate to an undisclosed part of the country. He was offered long-term therapy and support, but whether he continued to receive treatment remained unknown. Friends and former foster family members refused to comment publicly. Some said he wanted to move on and forget everything. Others weren't sure he ever truly would. The media frenzy surrounding the case didn't fade quickly. Documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions dissected every detail from Patricia's childhood trauma to the legal loopholes that allowed the marriage to happen in the first place. Experts debated whether she had been evil or deeply ill. Others focused on how vulnerable Benjamin had been and how icily the system failed to protect him. The incident led to new conversations about adult grooming, emotional abuse, and the complex boundaries of consent. For Patricia's surviving relatives, shame and confusion settled like a heavy fog. A cousin who had once tried to reconnect with her after her third husband disappeared told reporters that Patricia had always lived in her own world. No one had imagined her world would take such a twisted turn. Her children from other relationships, now adults themselves, completely severed ties and refused to speak her name again. To them, the woman who had once been their mother no longer existed. Today, Patricia serves her sentence in a medium-security prison, where she reportedly spends her days writing in notebooks, just as she did before her arrest. Prison staff say she remains polite but distant, speaking only when necessary. She continues to defend her actions, claiming she did what she believed was right. Though her freedom has been taken, her delusions remain firmly intact. Her story, horrifying and unforgettable, continues to haunt anyone who hears it.